on nondetail.com.
Thanks to our military and our allies and the brave fighters of Afghanistan, the Taliban regime is coming to an end.
So let me be clear. Al-Qaeda and its allies, the terrorists who planned and supported the 9/11 attacks, are in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Multiple intelligence estimates have warned that Al-Qaeda is actively planning attacks on the United States homeland from its safe haven in Pakistan. And if the Afghan government falls to the Taliban or allows Al-Qaeda to go unchallenged, that country will again be a base for terrorists who want to kill as many of our people as they possibly can. The future of Afghanistan is inextricably linked to the future of its neighbor Pakistan.
President Barack Obama has ordered 30,000 U.S. troops to get into Afghanistan quickly. He wants to start getting them out again within 18 months.
These additional American and international troops will allow us to accelerate handing over responsibility to Afghan forces and allow us to begin the transfer of our forces out of Afghanistan in July of 2011.
Area that I brought up with our generals 4 or 5 weeks ago, where Taliban is here, ISIS is here, and they're fighting each other. I said, why don't you let them fight? Why are we getting in the middle of it? I said, let them fight. They're both our enemies. Let them fight. Sir, we want to do it. They go in and they end up fighting both of them. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen.
To congratulate all of those incredible people that have worked for so long on our endless war in Afghanistan, 19 years, going on 20 years, and there hasn't been a moment like this. We've had very successful negotiations. We think they'll be successful in the end. The other side's tired of war. Everybody's tired of war. That's been a particularly long and gruesome one. And I want to congratulate President Ghani and the people of Afghanistan.
Talk to us about Afghanistan. Is the drawdown going to be done in the next few days?
No. No, we're on track exactly as to where we expect it to be. But I wanted to make sure there was enough, quote, running room that we wouldn't be able to do it all till September. There'll still be some full forces left, but it's a rational drawdown with our allies, and it's making so there's nothing unusual about it.
Are you worried that the Afghan government might fall? I mean, we are hearing about the Taliban is taking more and more districts.
Look, we're in that war for 20 years. 20 years. And I think I met with the Afghan government here in the White House, in the Oval. I think they have the capacity to be able to sustain the government. There's going to have to be, down the road, more negotiations, I suspect. But I am concerned that they deal with the internal issues that they have to be able to generate the kind of support they need nationwide to maintain the government.
Thought on Afghanistan.
I want to talk about happy things, man.
If there is evidence that Kabul is threatened, which some of the intelligence reports have suggested it could be in 6 months or thereabouts, do you think you've got the capability to help provide any kind of air support, military support to them to keep the capital safe, even if the U.S. troops are obviously fully out.
We have worked out an over-horizon capacity. We can be value added, but the Afghans are going to have to be able to do it themselves with the Air Force they have, which you're helping to maintain. I'm not going to answer any more questions on Afghanistan. Look, it's 4th of July. I'm concerned that you guys are asking me questions that I'll answer next week, but on this holiday weekend, I'm going to celebrate it. There's great things happening.
President Biden this morning facing a catastrophic failure of U.S. foreign policy. Our only glimpse of the president in the last 24 hours, this White House photo showing him seated alone at Camp David, consulting by video conference with national security advisors.
There can be no peace in a world of sudden terror. We did not ask for this mission, but we will fulfill it.
I completely agree that there are Al-Qaeda and Taliban in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. Certainly they are crossing from Pakistan side and causing bomb blast and terrorist activity in your country.
We must reverse the Taliban's momentum and deny it the ability to overthrow the government. And we must strengthen the capacity of Afghanistan's security forces and government so that they can take lead responsibility for Afghanistan's future.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
Taliban's gender apartheid back, even women in posters not spared, women's photographs covered up In Afghanistan, Taliban begins the gender.
नमस्कार देवियों और बहनों, भारत माता की जय। वायुयान के कप्तान ग्रुप कैप्टन राहुल सिंह की तरफ से मैं मास्टर वारंट ऑफिसर नारायण सुधारन आप सबका हार्दिक स्वागत करता हूँ। हम लोग काबुल से जामनगर भारत जा रहे हैं। उड़ान के ऊपर नंबर सीधा सीट और उड़ान अवधि आपसे निवेदन है कि कृपया अपनी सीटों पर बैठे रहें और सीट बेल्ट बांध लें।
Why did the international aid and reconstruction agenda for Afghanistan fail? The international community, led by the United States, has appropriated more than $100 billion in aid in the last decade to reconstruct Afghanistan and rebuild its unbalanced economy. Foreign donors pledged a projected $12 billion in civilian aid to Afghanistan over the next 4 years at a conference, but many made it conditional on protecting human rights and making progress on peace talks in a major shake-up for the country's economy. Some improvements were seen in terms of the GDP growth, life expectancy, poverty reduction, child and maternal health, education, and infrastructure. These improvements are relatively modest in relation to the amount of dollars poured into the country as aid. Moreover, this rate of improvement is too slow for Afghanistan to catch up with the rest of the developing world. Afghanistan still ranks third in the world in corruption according to Transparency International, which contributes to its extreme poverty. Although education is more widely available, the quality does not meet world standards. The teaching profession is not attractive because of the low pay. Despite improvements in the health sector, health indicators still remain below the average for low-income countries. Agriculture, the second largest contributor to GDP growth after services, declined by a projected 2% in 2015. Perhaps, for Afghanistan, as a post-conflict country, the aid was too little too soon. With the government institutions fragile and incapable of handling foreign aid, and with the weak technical capacity, the country was not ready to absorb and spend aid money wisely. Among the many side effects of aid is the Dutch disease effect. Flooding US dollars in billions into Afghanistan, a small open economy, adversely affected the country's economy in terms of inflation and exports. Foreign currency inflows appreciate Afghan currency, making domestic goods less price competitive on the export market, and preventing exporters from competing. It also killed the domestic demand for Afghan goods, as the goods became more expensive. This caused businesses to close and people to lose their jobs, resulting in increasing poverty. With more poverty, Afghanistan needed more aid money, ending up in a vicious cycle. Much of the corruption in Afghanistan also stemmed from an inflow of aid money, giving the country one of the worst reputations in the world, British Prime Minister David Cameron recently called the country fantastically corrupt. Aid is flowing in without question and mostly goes into the pockets of corrupt officials in a system that lacks accountability. As Peter Bauer, the famed development economist, has rightly said, foreign aid is an excellent method for transferring money from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. Talking about rich people in poor countries, the Afghan Minister of National Defense, Bismillah Mohammadi, issued a brief tweet Sunday after President Ashraf Ghani and senior officials had left Afghanistan. In a clear reference to the former president, he said, "They tied our hands behind our backs and sold the homeland, damn the rich man and his gang." Coming back to the reasons, most farmers left their farms and moved to cities to work for construction companies as gatekeepers or cooks and thus contributed to the country's dependency on neighbors for food staples. Afghanistan ranks 177th in terms of regulation quality and efficiency for investment. With no improvements, the number of new firm registrations in 2015 remained well below that of 2012-13. This shows the difficulties in launching new businesses in Afghanistan. The fact that the country has made no improvements over the past many years shows that the government was not interested in creating jobs, or creating systems for entrepreneurships. The government officials did not rely on taxes to stay in office, they relied on the aid. They became so dependent on foreign aid, that the politicians in Afghanistan spent much of their time courting and catering to international donors, rather than to their constituents. Donors, not citizens, determined the future direction of the country, as the conditionality of aid gave donors the control over the use and direction of their funds. Afghanistan's aid dependency was having negative consequences not only economically, but politically too. At an international donor conference in November 2020, representatives from 70 countries, including Germany, US $510 million, Norway, US $72 million, the United Kingdom, US $227 million, and a number of humanitarian organizations pledged conditional aid of US $12 billion over the next 4 years, emphasizing the importance that Western nations have placed on the protection of human rights. Notably, the country's US $11 billion public expenditure each year was much higher than its modest revenues, which even after significant improvements recently, barely reached US $2.5 billion. The difference of about 75% of the expenses was funded by the international grants. When aid was cut off in the past, it was detrimental to the lives of Afghans. Afghanistan was also substantially reliant on military aid for its security forces that are embroiled in an intensifying war with the Taliban. Compared to the low-income country average of around 3% of GDP, security expenditure in Afghanistan stood at around 28% of the GDP in 2019, and most of this expenditure came from foreign assistance, especially from the US. The U.S. Congress appropriated at least US $86.4 billion for Afghan security assistance between fiscal years 2002 and 2019. Additionally, around 57% of total U.S. assistance has gone to the Afghan Security Forces Fund, and the U.S. military spends about US $36 billion annually, roughly US $100 million a day, in Afghanistan. The Afghan forces also lost out on the single most important military advantage of air power when private contractors and the U.S. troops left. The security forces majorly rely on US-funded contractors to repair and maintain the dozens of fighter planes, cargo aircrafts, helicopters, etc. Over 18,000 contractors were due to depart soon, along with a majority of the U.S. military contingent. Thus, reduction in aid was extremely detrimental to the already fragile security situation in Afghanistan because without any on-ground US troops, an aid-dependent Afghan force with reduced capabilities was the only line of defense against the Taliban's incessantly violent tactics. What could the West have done better in terms of aid and reconstruction? Michael E. O'Hanlon wrote in a 2001 report, which meant the US was well aware of what it should do to reconstruct Afghanistan. But the question remains, has it done it? Michael wrote, "A good starting point for answering this question is to consider major development and reconstruction efforts. The Marshall Plan for Western Europe helped war-ravaged countries repair themselves quickly after World War II. It typically provided $100 to $200 per inhabitant per year over a period of several years, making for a cumulative total that often approached $1,000 per person in the end. But that effort was designed to help advanced countries rebuild infrastructure that had only recently been in good working condition. For Afghanistan, therefore, a more analogous model may be the experiences of South Korea and Taiwan in the 1950s and early 1960s. The first had been hurt by war much worse than the second, but in both cases, the United States wanted to help key security partners build up their economies as well as their military defenses on short order. Aid efforts could not be quite as rapid as in Western Europe or Japan, but in the end they were comparably generous. The United States provided roughly $50 to $75 per person per year for more than a decade, again making for an aggregate total ranging from $500 to $1,000. Based on these models, it might be reasonable to imagine that 20 to 25% of aid would be used for food and housing and medical care, 25% for rebuilding and developing infrastructure, 15 to 20% for education, 5 to 10% for government, 10 to 15% for agriculture, and the related task of clearing landmines, and 10 to 15% for building up security forces while helping excess militia fighters demobilize and find civilian jobs. In the case of Afghanistan, however, the latter figure for security aid might have to be larger than in many previous cases. Was this followed? Without which all the aid provided was more superficial and most of it went into the hands of a few corrupt rich people. As Carol Graham and Michael argued in a 1997 Brookings book, A Halfpenny on the Federal Dollar, The Future of Development Aid, and as other analysts such as the World Bank's David Dollar have demonstrated as well, aid can very easily be wasted if recipient governments do not create conducive economic and legal environments. One of the most important findings of modern political science is that countries moving towards democracy are highly vulnerable to conflict during their periods of intense transition. For evidence, one need only recall experiences such as Angola's in the early 1990s, when Jonas Savimbi agreed to elections but then returned to war after losing at the ballots to President Dos Santos, Rwanda in the mid-1990s when a fledgling peace process broke down and ended in genocide, and Somalia in the early 1990s when US and UN efforts to create a new Somali government failed, after which time militia leader Aidid's forces killed dozens of Pakistanis and Americans in ensuing battles. Second, and relatedly, donors should provide much of their aid and technical advice directly at the regional and grassroots level, an argument also advanced by the International Crisis Group in a 2001 study on Afghanistan's reconstruction needs. Doing so should dampen the struggle for power and resources in Kabul, as leaders from various regions and ethnic groups find comfort in knowing their peoples will be aided regardless of who wields the most influence at the federal level. Providing a good deal of aid in this way would also give donors leverage with regional leaders and governments inside of Afghanistan. All would receive some aid for feeding and housing their people, clearing landmines, and rebuilding roads. But only those that avoided major corruption and massive human rights abuses, while also following sound economic practices, would receive generous aid packages for broader development and reconstruction purposes. Again, was this done? Visuals this week tells us that this was not followed. Situation wouldn't have been this worse if the Afghan government focused upon involving Kabul in trade, foreign direct investment, FDI, microfinance, savings, and taxes, the instruments that the developed world uses to finance economic development and job creation. The Afghan government should have worked closely with the rest of the world, especially its neighbors, to open their doors for Afghan goods. The government could have also simplified legal procedures and other policies to facilitate entry for new businesses and support both domestic and foreign investment. FDI would bring in new technologies and new managerial skills, and help in creating jobs and capacity building. Innovations in microfinance to encourage small-scale entrepreneurs by providing support and opportunities could have helped in their economic growth. What did the US and Taliban negotiate? When the US declared a specific target date for the withdrawal of the forces, in all practical purposes, what were they negotiating for in Doha? Had the Taliban refused to agree to any terms, what could the US have done? It has already announced its departure. So, whether Taliban agreed or not, the US was leaving Afghanistan. Notably, Taliban didn't honor the promise to reduce violence following the February 2020 US-Taliban agreement in Doha. More than 3,000 civilians were killed and 5,800 others were injured in Afghanistan in 2020. A string of attacks have continued in 2021 too. A report by the UN monitoring team recently concluded that the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda remain closely aligned and show no indication of breaking ties, which is contradictory to the promises the group made under the Doha Agreement. The Taliban delegation also refused to show up for the Istanbul talks amid escalating violence, highlighting its disregard for a peaceful political settlement. Taliban demanded the cancellation of United Nations sanctions in exchange for the US asking for a 3 to 6 month extension for troop withdrawal, which could not take place before the pre-set deadline of 1 May 2021. Such was the situation of the US during these peace negotiations in Doha. What are the consequences of Taliban-led Afghanistan? Firstly, women and young girls may suffer, because the Taliban's ideology towards women remains regressive, orthodox, and downright extremist. This apprehension has been adequately validated recently, with the Taliban having targeted women in the media, female judges, and even schoolgirls. Secondly, the human rights of various ethnic groups such as the Shia Hazaras, Ismaili Shias, Hindus and Sikhs remain in question and need to be protected. These communities have been historically persecuted and dominated by the Sunni majorities, and according to the 2020 International Religious Freedom Report, terrorist groups in Afghanistan continue to target specific religious and ethno-religious minorities. Why did world countries invest in Afghanistan? Western leaders have promised to be generous in helping Afghanistan recover from 2 decades of war, recognizing that their failure to do so after the Afghan Mujahideen defeated the Soviet Union in 1989 helped give rise to the very conditions that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda later exploited. What's in stake for India? The Taliban's triumph threatens not just India's diplomatic stakes in Afghanistan, but also 20 years and $3 billion worth of Indian investment in various projects, dams, roads, trade infrastructure. Afghanistan is vital to India's strategic interests in the region. It is also perhaps the only SAARC nation whose people have much affection for India. India built vital roads, dams, electricity transmission lines and substations, schools and hospitals, etc. India's development assistance is now estimated to be worth well over $3 billion. And unlike in other countries where India's infrastructure projects have barely got off the ground or are mired in the host nation's politics, it has delivered in Afghanistan. The 2011 India-Afghanistan Strategic Partnership Agreement recommitted Indian assistance to help rebuild Afghanistan's infrastructure and institutions, education and technical assistance for capacity building in many areas, encourage investment in Afghanistan, and provide duty-free access to the Indian market. Bilateral trade is now worth $1 billion. Speaking at the Afghanistan conference in Geneva in November 2020, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said, "No part of Afghanistan today is untouched by the 400-plus projects that India has undertaken in all 34 of Afghanistan's provinces. The fate of these projects is now up in the air." The Afghan parliament in Kabul was built by India at $90 million. It was opened in 2015. Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurated the building. In an expansive speech about India-Afghanistan friendship, he quoted Rumi, who was born in Balkh, Afghanistan, and the immortal Yari Hai Aman Mera Ya Meri Zindagi from Zanjir, featuring Pran in the role of Sher Khan, the Pathan. Modi described the building as India's tribute to democracy in Afghanistan. A block in the building is named after former PM Vajpayee.
Day-long visit. It's an official but unannounced visit due to security reasons, and he is inaugurating the parliament complex that India helped.
What should India be doing now? China has already shown readiness in recognizing the Taliban government. Now the US has changed its stance and has declared that it can recognize the Taliban if they protect human rights. So, India should also showcase the willingness to recognize the same conditions in place. It shouldn't procrastinate the decision here, since Taliban considers the current Indian government as adversary, since India proactively engaged with the Afghan government and supported its fight against Taliban. Also, we have Pakistan and China who would find a lot of common ground with the Taliban, which may not be in India's best interest. So, we have to move swiftly and strategically to get the current dispensation on our side.
Mujahideen fought a Soviet occupation for 9 years. They even got money and weapons from the CIA. In 1989, the Soviets pulled out, and the next few years were pretty chaotic. By 1992, there was a full-blown civil war with tribal leaders fighting for power. 2 years later, a militia called the Taliban started getting attention. Many of its members had studied in conservative religious schools in Afghanistan and across the border in Pakistan, and some of them had also fought as Mujahideen. And they had their own plans for the country.
The people were so frustrated with this lawlessness And the Taliban came marching along from Kandahar to city to city to city, saying, we're gonna make the cities safe for you again.
By 1996, the Taliban had seized the capital. They declared Afghanistan an Islamic emirate and started imposing their own strict interpretation of Islamic law.
They were like, you can't watch movies, you can't listen to music, women can't go to school, and other than doctors, they can't go to work. You have to wear a certain type of clothes, you have to have a certain kind of beard, it just became more and more restrictive.
Then 9/11 happened. The US was after al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden, who was hiding out in Afghanistan with the Taliban's help. The Taliban said they wanted proof he was behind the attack, and when they refused to hand him over immediately, the Americans invaded.
The Taliban will pay a price.
Within a couple of months, the Taliban were forced out of power, and Afghanistan got a new interim government. 3 years later, it got a new constitution, and Hamid Karzai was elected president. While that was going on, the Taliban had regrouped. They wanted foreigners out, and they wanted back in. What followed were years of devastating conflict, and it's still going on. More than 40,000 Afghan civilians killed, at least 64,000 Afghan military and police, and more than 3,500 international soldiers dead. The US alone has spent almost $1 trillion on the war and reconstruction projects. And after all that, Afghanistan is still deeply unstable, and the Taliban are still a force to reckon with.
They're an insurgency fighting international occupation as they see it. They're fighting an illegitimate government in Kabul as they see it. And they're a voice of resistance to, as they see it, return Afghanistan to a more pure Islamic society.
Today, the Taliban have as many as 85,000 full-time fighters and training camps across the country, and the area they control has been growing. Right now, the Taliban control 1/5 of Afghan districts. On top of that, half of all districts are considered contested, which means the Taliban have a strong presence in many of those places too. And they control parts of some major highways.
Whoever controls the roads in Afghanistan, pretty much controls the country. They've managed to basically give people the sense that, wherever you go, you'll have to deal with the Taliban.
They're also well organized. The Taliban's leader is Haibatullah Akhundzada. He heads a council that oversees about a dozen commissions in charge of things like finance, health, and education. Below them are local officials in charge of everyday services. So in a way, the Taliban have set up a parallel state. They even run their own courts, which can be pretty popular among Afghans.
Justice has been a huge gap in Afghanistan, and where the state courts have failed, these Sharia courts are able to come into communities who may even be reticent to support the Taliban, but they offer justice.
All that control has also made them rich. According to Taliban members and a UN committee, they make close to $1.5 billion a year. They've always made a lot of money from growing opium poppies and the drug trade, but they found even more ways to generate income. Last year, they made millions from mining and trading minerals and even producing methamphetamine. They also have their own tax collection system and receive funding from abroad, although suspected sources like Pakistan and Iran deny it.
Back in 1978, Afghanistan, ruled by a communist government, was fighting the insurgent Islamic guerrillas referred to as Mujahideens. The Afghan government got support from the Soviet Union, which used its superior military power to control civilians and several Mujahideen groups. These insurgent groups got the backing of the United States, making Afghanistan another platform for a proxy war. But after a decade of conflict, the Soviet Union, which was on the verge of collapse, withdrew its troops from the region. And in the early 1990s, a few men from northern Pakistan formed the Taliban, which means students in the Pashto language. When the Taliban announced the formation of an Islamic government in Afghanistan, several warlords joined them. Taliban leaders marched across the country, extending its influence. In September 1995, they captured the province of Herat, bordering Iran, and exactly 1 year later, they captured the Afghan capital, Kabul, overthrowing the regime of President Burhanuddin Rabbani. In 1996, Taliban formed an Islamic government and shifted the country's capital from Kabul to Kandahar. By 1998, the Taliban controlled almost 90% of Afghanistan. The Taliban also destroyed the famous Bamia Buddhist statues in central Afghanistan in the face of massive international outrage. When Air India flight IC-814 was hijacked by terrorists in December 1999, they landed the aircraft in Kandahar, which was controlled by the Taliban. Reports suggest that armed fighters of the Taliban surrounded the aircraft and later even provided the hijackers safe passage back to Pakistan. While the Taliban's backing for such terror elements was no secret, it was the 9/11 attacks that brought the focus of the world back on Taliban, mainly for sheltering Osama bin Laden. On October 7, 2001, a US-led military coalition launched attacks in Afghanistan.
The United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And now, the Taliban will pay a price. American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, making Afghanistan their second priority. Eventually, the United States reduced the number of troops in Afghanistan. This helped the Taliban regain a significant amount of territory and power. While the world has been largely skeptical of Taliban's activities and ideologies, Pakistan has played a key role in the origin and sustenance of the extremist group. Many Afghans who initially joined the movement were educated in madrasas in Pakistan. Apart from Saudi Arabia and UAE, Pakistan was also one of only 3 countries to recognize the Taliban when they ruled Afghanistan. Later, when the US-led coalition launched attacks in Afghanistan, many senior Taliban leaders took refuge in Pakistan.
Remember, very public declarations from everybody going back to President Bush, Colin Powell in those days. President Musharraf would give guarantees that Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar were not in Pakistan, all of which turned out to be false, by the way. The Quetta Shura, the governing body of the Taliban, was in fact in Pakistan. Osama bin Laden was in fact in Pakistan. So the Pakistanis have been playing a double game and being fairly deceptive about this from the start.
But Pakistan's Frankenstein monster struck back, and at one point threatened to destabilize Pakistan. One of the most internationally condemned of all Pakistani Taliban attacks took place in October 2012, when Malala Yousafzai was shot on her way home in the town of Mingora. Some reports suggest the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has claimed 32 attacks inside Pakistan in 2021 alone. So how has the Taliban outlasted the US and NATO missions? Years of being on international terror blacklists and the domestic backlash to its repressive tactics. Apart from the support it receives from Pakistan, other anti-American forces also fund the Taliban to bleed NATO. Taliban has also managed to increase the support base inside the country. While the Taliban largely remains a Pashtun movement, they have also made inroads into other ethnic groups. There is evidence of grassroots recruitment of small groups of ideologically committed Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaras, among others. A 2017 Pentagon report said that the integration between the Taliban and the Haqqani network is also responsible for the apparent increase in their strength. Additionally, the Taliban also managed to frame the international military intervention as a wider war against Islam, adding to the anger among a section of citizens in the country.
The Taliban remains a very powerful, lethal fighting force that has been, fighting for the last 20 years. The people who have been in government, the Afghan National Army, things like places like that, have simply not been as battle-hardened as these Taliban warriors. And so there's a military point and then there's a political point. The Taliban do represent some part of a disgruntled Pashtun population of Afghanistan that does not recognize the government of Afghanistan as legitimate, views this as the remnants of the old Northern Alliance, and so is fighting very hard. So those two features, military effectiveness and a real political cause, have combined to produce a situation where you can't really defeat the Taliban, and the Taliban is doing pretty well on the battlefield.
In comparison to the Taliban, the Afghan government brings in over $5 billion every year. But Kabul also spends heavily on war, often at the expense of basic public services and economic development. The years of devastating war saw more than 40,000 Afghan civilians killed, over 64,000 Afghan military and police personnel dead, and nearly 4,000 international soldiers dead. The United States too infused almost $1 trillion in war and infrastructure projects. Despite all that money and military fight, Afghanistan still remains far from stable. While several countries have tried to push for peace talks, nothing conclusive has been achieved. With US and NATO formally withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, the Taliban have got a new lease of life.
I went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Office. I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. Events we're seeing now are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a stable, united, secure Afghanistan, as known in history as the graveyard of empires.
The Soviet Union also invaded Afghanistan, and after 9 years, they also withdrew, and the regime they fought so hard to prop up almost immediately collapsed. And before them, the British Empire invaded Afghanistan on 3 separate occasions and failed to conquer them in each instance. Today, Afghanistan has a smaller population than California in a territory that's only a little larger than France. So how is it that a country of this small size was capable of resisting 3 of the world's most powerful military juggernauts from history? There's a lot of answers to that question, but let's start with the easiest to understand and perhaps the most obvious: geography. In reality, Afghanistan is little more than a geographical expression. All of her borders were arbitrarily drawn up by outside foreign powers more than a century ago. Its small population is composed of a loose association of 14 different ethno-linguistic groups and numerous more tribes, many of which, like the Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Pashtuns, straddle the country's borders. Artificial boundaries set up by Westerners hundreds of years ago that mean very little to them. The Pashtuns make up nearly half of Afghanistan's population today, but 2/3 of all Pashtuns live next door in neighboring Pakistan and are a minority group there. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan runs directly through the Pashtun tribal area and divides the 60 million Pashtun people between both countries. This boundary was artificially decided by the British Empire back in 1893, and to date, not a single government based in Afghanistan has ever officially ratified it. Imagine if in Europe, Poland was divided between Germany and Russia, and a wall was built directly between both sides of where the Poles live. Obviously, the Poles would never recognize this border and routinely cross it to visit family and friends. And the Pashtuns largely treat the Afghan-Pakistan border the very same way. The border here is extremely mountainous and rural, so patrolling it from the Pakistani government's perspective has always been quite challenging. This has allowed Pashtun insurgents operating within Afghanistan the valuable ability to easily escape across the border into the friendly Pashtun areas of Pakistan, regroup and recover, recruit more men, and then travel back into Afghanistan freshly supplied and ready for more combat. Neither the Afghan border nor the Taliban recognize this border as legitimate, and there are at least 235 known crossing points across the border and through the mountains between both countries. Militants, drugs, money, and supplies can easily be smuggled into Afghanistan by way of Pakistan, and it's made all the easier by many of the Pashtuns of Pakistan being more sympathetic to the Afghan or Taliban cause. This has led many people to label the Afghan-Pakistan border as the most dangerous border in the entire world. And recently, as a result of all of this, by the end of June 2021, Pakistan has finally finished building a fence across the entire length of the border, specifically to stop all of this, and has restricted border crossings to only 16 legally designated locations. But this is all only the start of what makes Afghanistan an almost impossible place to conquer. I mean, just look at the map. Afghanistan is landlocked, so getting your troops and supplies there requires the cooperation of at least one of the 6 countries that borders it: Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, China, and of course Pakistan. But even once you get across one of these countries and you arrive at Afghanistan's borders, you're going to be met with Afghanistan's monumentally challenging terrain. Despite being in the center of the world's most populous continent, Afghanistan has always been heavily isolated and largely rural and underpopulated because of this: the high peaks of the Hindu Kush mountain range with some of the tallest and biggest mountains found anywhere on the planet. 75% of Afghanistan's territory is considered to be mountainous, and nearly half of our territory has an elevation above 2,000 meters, which makes Afghanistan among the most mountainous countries of the world, and among the most isolated too as a result. These huge mountains act like natural walls in more ways than one. They help to keep invaders out, but they also separate communities within and make transporting supplies across challenging. These are all very difficult factors to overcome from the perspective of any outside invader. There are dozens of valleys that zigzag in between the mountains of Afghanistan where most of the population resides. And since they're surrounded by some of the biggest and most formidable mountains on Earth, it's always been difficult to travel between them, and consequently, they're each sort of their own little world inside of Afghanistan. Over thousands of years, they each ended up developing their own rather distinctive cultures, identities, beliefs, tribes, and rulers, and thus, there's very little sense of Afghan nationhood, and Afghan patriotism has never been a particularly strong motivating factor. Because of all these separate and rural communities that are difficult to travel between, the grip of any central government has always been weak and intermittent, while the valleys have largely governed themselves autonomously, especially in the countryside. Any semblance of Afghan national unity has always been a direct consequence of foreign powers invading and attempting to impose their rule over the whole, like with the British, Soviets, and recently Americans. Historically, and up to the present day to an extent, Afghanistan continues to operate in a way that's more similar to the Holy Roman Empire than the European Union. The ruler in the capital city Kabul may nominally wield de jure authority over the entire realm, like the Holy Roman Emperor, but is not able to wield de facto authority over all of the various princes, valleys, tribes, and clans, just like the Holy Roman Emperor. Any invader coming in to occupy Afghanistan will struggle with all of the same issues that a domestic ruler will. Afghanistan's geography is not very conducive to a centralized authority, and neither is Afghanistan's infrastructure. Enforcing your authority across the various Afghan valleys means that you must move your troops and supplies from one to another through the various mountain passes that are often narrow and incredibly easy positions to set up an ambush in as a defender. These passes basically act like natural choke points for the movement of people all across Afghanistan, and up until the 1960s, there were hardly even any roads to speak of that went through them. Control over just a few of these mountain passes can ensure control over an entire valley, and sabotaging one can block the flow of supplies and troops for days, weeks, or even longer depending upon the severity of the damage. When the Soviets invaded the country, the Mujahideen defenders would ambush Soviet convoys as they traveled through these passes, and then immediately flee back and vanish into the caves of the mountains when they were fired back upon. They would set up roadblocks at river crossings or in other passes, and in some instances were successful enough to block entire roads for months or even years. The town of Khost near the Pakistan border was permanently sealed off from the rest of the country for the entire war by the Mujahideen, sabotaging a series of strategic roads, and the government forces blocked inside could only be supplied by air. And when the Americans invaded, these passes were just as vital. Most significant for them was the Khyber Pass here, the easiest and most direct path through the Hindu Kush between the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia. This path has been used for thousands of years by conquerors, traders, and missionaries all alike, and is without a doubt one of the most strategic locations to hold on the entire planet. At one point, nearly 80% of all NATO and US supplies that were being brought into Afghanistan by road were all coming through the Khyber Pass via Pakistan. which is kind of ironic because most of the Taliban's equipment were also coming from across the border in Pakistan, just at different and more rural crossing points. The Taliban knew how critically important the Khyber Pass was to the American war effort, so it was a frequent target of sabotage efforts. In 2009, the Taliban blew up a bridge here that temporarily shut down the entire pass, and America was forced to broaden their supply lines into Afghanistan through the 3 Central Asian bordering countries as well. In the years before all of this war, the Afghan government had attempted to build a circular highway that would connect all of their major economic centers together. But over the decades of civil war and Soviet intervention, the highway was in very bad shape. By the time the United States invaded in 2001, there were only a mere 50 kilometers of paved roads to speak of in the entire country that's bigger than France. For comparison, France has 1.1 million kilometers of paved roads in a smaller and significantly less mountainous territory. The lack of good roads only made the disparate valleys and communities of the Afghan interior even more isolated from each other, and it made transporting troops and supplies a logistical nightmare for the Americans and the Soviets before them, none of which helped at all for the country's stability. As with all things in Afghanistan, the development of new roads is difficult and expensive because of the harsh mountainous terrain, the cold winter weather that often chews roads up, and sabotage from the Taliban and other insurgents. Building or repairing roads in the country necessitates hiring security and necessitates building them across harsh geography and climates, which means that it can get incredibly expensive, as much as $5 million per mile in some locations. And this is all in a country where the average person only makes a little over $500 a year, one of the poorest and least developed nations on the planet. The construction of a single mile of road within Afghanistan is about the combined annual wages of 9,800 Afghanis. So, obviously, the funding for all of these projects has to come from abroad. Ultimately, Afghanistan is easy to invade and take over, but it's almost impossible to effectively hold it for long. The landscape is huge, with a lot of rural and empty places for insurgents and rebels to hide. Getting troops in and establishing supply lines through massive mountains and narrow passes is challenging and easy for guerrilla combatants to harass and disrupt. The relationship with neighboring Pakistan is complex, and Pashtun insurgents can easily cross the border and regroup without much fear, and then return to fight in Afghanistan whenever ready. The flow of insurgent supplies, money, and manpower across the border is difficult to stop through the hundreds of high and remote mountain passes, and requires the cooperation of Pakistan, which she is sometimes willing to give and other times not. Centralized rule is almost impossible to enforce outside of Kabul by way of Afghanistan's geographic reality, and nation building is inherently impossible because even the concept of an Afghan nation among Afghanistan's various ethnicities and tribes is tenuous at best, and certainly radically different from the Western idea of nation-states such as Germany or France. The colonial-era borders of Afghanistan dictated by the British over a century ago are probably the biggest core reason for Afghanistan's instability, but Afghanistan has been particularly unstable even by former British colonial meddling.
In March 1947, Earl Louis Mountbatten and his wife Edwina arrive in New Delhi. The great-grandson of Queen Victoria and second cousin to George VI, Mountbatten brings a regal presence to the drama of India's independence. As the last viceroy, he bears responsibility for India's fate.
2nd of April, 1947. I have now completed my first week in office. I should like to be able to paint an encouraging picture of my first impressions, but feel it would be misleading if I did so. The scene here is one of unrelieved gloom. At this early stage, I can see little common ground on which to build any agreed solution for the future of India. The only conclusion I have been able to come to is that unless I act quickly, I may well find the real beginnings of a civil war on my hands.
By May, attempts to create a unified India have failed. Gandhi retreats from political life. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, and Jawaharlal Nehru of the Indian National Congress concede to divide India. Fearing a total loss of control, Mountbatten brings forward the transfer of power to August. Two nations will be created by partition, a secular India and a new homeland for India's Muslims, Pakistan. Independence, Nehru addresses the people of India.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
The 15th of August, 1947. The British Empire in India has come to an end. The last Viceroy, Louis Mountbatten.
The flag raising and the salute were done amid scenes of the most fantastic rejoicing. And as the flag broke, a brilliant rainbow appeared in the sky, which was taken by the crowd as a good omen.
Qasim Muhammad.
On the 15th of August came freedom. The freedom to burn, loot and murder. While Delhi and Karachi were celebrating, central Punjab was burning.
Between August 1947 and March 1948, 4.5 million Hindus and Sikhs are forced to migrate from Pakistan to India. 6 million Muslims must move in the opposite direction. Britons and Indians witness the bloodshed. Shahid Ahmed.
It is a battleground. People have gone mad. Trains to Pakistan are being looted and occupants slaughtered. We all knew that carnage was in the offing. So did Mountbatten. The British Empire, which tried to build India over centuries, can never live down this great tragedy.
Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Boyd Hudson.
The sight from the air was awe-inspiring. In this chaos, millions of refugees were struggling to get to India or Pakistan. Thousands of others were doing their best to prevent them, murdering them by the hundred. But death is nothing. There are things more terrible than death.
Ten million people are displaced in the partition of India. 1 million are dead. By the summer of 1948, most of the British have left. Hubert Boyd Hudson has been in India for 15 years.
India is full of ghosts. Houses I have lived in, now inhabited by Indians, remind me of the days which will never come again. When the Viceroy drove past with a cavalry escort in red coats, I have seen the greatness of the British in India, but now it is all ended, and we are the last to leave, the few who are trying to tidy up the mess which the sudden splitting of an old empire has caused.
Britain has lost its greatest imperial possession. Mahatma Gandhi once said that if India became free, the rest of the empire would follow. In the next 10 years, the fire of India's independence will spread around the globe, from the Middle East to Africa.
Preparing for a withdrawal, some of the 700 US troops whose work training local forces in Somalia is coming to a premature end, raising questions about the fight against the armed group Al-Shabaab.
The blow from the U.S. operational standpoint is that over time it'll lose its ability to have American eyes on the ground, to have more interaction with Somalian troops who have not proven that resilient in the fight against terrorism and needed that U.S. backing. And so it really is a blow to Somalia in that sense, and for no good reason.
President Donald Trump has ordered their withdrawal as part of his plan to reduce U.S. involvement in military missions abroad. It comes after announcements last month to draw down troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Trump says he's determined to fulfill the election promises he made before he leaves the White House next month. The Pentagon says it's concerned about the threat posed by Al-Shabaab, and one Democratic congressman on the House Armed Services Committee says the withdrawal of US troops is, in his words, a surrender to Al-Qaeda and a gift to China. Analysts say President-elect Joe Biden could reverse Trump's drawdown.
The U.S. is all over Africa. They're all over the world. There's some, 40 or 50 countries with American troops. And so Biden will probably be able to get that level of troops back into Somalia if he needs to.
The Pentagon hasn't said how many US personnel will stay in Somalia to train and advise local forces. But critics say the withdrawal could not come at a worse time, with fighting in neighbouring Ethiopia and upcoming elections in Somalia. Victoria.
"4 years and 2 months ago, when I first came into this office as president, by far the most difficult problem confronting the nation was the seemingly endless war in Vietnam. 550,000 Americans were in Vietnam. As many as 300 a week were being killed in action. Hundreds were held as prisoners of war in North Vietnam. And no progress was being made at the peace negotiations. I immediately initiated a program to end the war and win an honorable peace. 11 times over the past 4 years, I have reported to the nation from this room on the progress we have made toward that goal. And tonight, the day we have all worked and prayed for has finally come. For the first time in 12 years, no American military forces are in Vietnam. All of our American POWs are on their way home. The 17 million people of South Vietnam have the right to choose their own government without outside interference. And because of our program of Vietnamization, they have the strength to defend that right. We have prevented the imposition of a communist government by force on South Vietnam. There are still some problem areas. The provisions of the agreement requiring an accounting for all missing in action in Indochina. The provisions with regard to Laos and Cambodia. The provisions prohibiting infiltration from North Vietnam into South Vietnam have not been complied with. We have and will continue to comply with the agreement. We shall insist that North Vietnam comply with the agreement. And the leaders of North Vietnam should have no doubt as to the consequences if they fail to comply with the agreement.
sit you in and good luck to you. Don't say anything, Walt. What is it?
This helicopter looks like so many others in the row. Just a vintage machine at the boneyard supplying parts to others. But this CH-46 has more than 11,000 air hours and a special place in history.
This one here was the last aircraft out of Vietnam. Back in April 30th, 1975, during Operation Frequent Wind, this aircraft picked up the Marine Guard off the US Embassy building in Saigon.
When most people think of the last helicopter out of Saigon, this is the image that comes to mind.
Actually, that famous picture you see really isn't the US Embassy. That is an apartment complex down the street from the US Embassy called the Pittman Apartment Complex. And that housed the CIA, a lot of CIA folks, and it also housed folks from USAID. And that aircraft was an Air America Huey that had landed on that rooftop to take out some folks. So a lot of people get confused thinking that was the US Embassy. That really wasn't the embassy.
Back at the embassy, the big CH-53 helicopters, along with the CH-46s, were ferrying people away from Saigon. There were a number of landing zones in and around the embassy complex. The one on the left is where the Marine Guards waited for their ride. The problem was, a misunderstanding left them without a helicopter.
The aircraft that took the ambassador, U.S. ambassador out, Graham Martin, was another H-46, just like this one. It was 154803, which is in San Diego, the Flying Leatherneck Museum in San Diego. Took the ambassador out at about 0500 in the morning on April 30th. And the guard was left behind, and when 154803, which was call sign was Lady Ace 09, took off, it sent out a code message that said the Tiger is out. And all the other aircraft in the area thought that meant that the mission was complete. And they